Hello, my name's Madeline Garlick. I am a guest researcher at the Nijmegen University Centre for Migration Law. I'm also a fellow with the Open Society Foundations working with the Migration Policy Institute. And for many years, I was head of UNHCR's Policy and Legal Support Unit at its Bureau for Europe in Brussels. I'm going to speak to you today about Syrian refugees and ask the question whether this constitutes the greatest challenge that the common European asylum system has faced until now. I believe it's strongly arguable that the Syria conflict and the related forced displacement it has triggered constitutes the most significant challenge that the EU's common European asylum system has faced since its inception in 1999. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has called the Syria conflict the most dramatic humanitarian crisis the world has seen in modern times. UNHCR's largest refugee population today is made up of Syrian refugees spread throughout the region and further afield. Yet the European Union has only 200,000 Syrian asylum seekers who have claimed protection in its territory to date. That's a number which is smaller than the total number of Syrian refugees in Iraq alone. And these are people spread across 28 wealthy EU member states who have today at their disposal arguably the largest range of legal instruments, financial resources, and institutional tools and policies at their disposal to deal with refugees than they have ever had in their history. I will thus today ask the question as to why the European Union's response has been less comprehensive than it could have been, and what could and should be done to improve it. I believe this is crucial as a matter of international and European law, and also to ensure fulfilment of the principle of solidarity and responsibility sharing to which the European Union has expressed repeated commitment in the refugee and asylum context. I'd like to start today by quoting the former Lebanese president, Michel Suleiman, who in 2013 said, and I quote, that these numbers are more than the capacity of any country to bear. He said the world should think about how to alleviate this burden because for humanitarian reasons, we cannot turn back any refugee who is hungry, wounded, frightened or persecuted. He was president of a country which today hosts the largest per capita refugee population in the world, with approximately 1.2 million Syrian refugees in a country with a population of 4 million. This is equivalent to 20 million Syrian refugees in Germany, or the entire population of Germany seeking protection in the United States. It's interesting to contrast this generous response with that of the European Union. Just a few months later, in late 2013, the former European Commissioner for Humanitarian Affairs, Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva, was quoted as saying that European countries must not only keep our hearts and our wallets open, but also our borders. Significantly, however, she was not responsible at the time for the EU's refugee and border policies, and today she is no longer dealing with humanitarian aid. Today I'd like to touch upon 4 topics. First of all, the evolution of the conflict and forced displacement. Secondly, the international protection needs of Syrians in legal terms under international refugee law. Thirdly, I will examine the European responses to Syrian refugees to date. And finally, pose some questions for reflection around whether the EU's common policy on asylum has met its challenge. Firstly, on the evolution of the conflict and forced displacement until now. It was March 2011 when the Syrian uprising began, and the government deployed tanks and military forces to quell opposition in the streets at the time. Despite US and EU sanctions, that repression continued, and significant displacement began within Syria itself and into neighbouring countries. The following year, in 2012, the UN and Arab League together deployed envoys to try and resolve the conflict unsuccessfully. Violence continued and escalated, and chemical weapons were reported to have been used in August 2013. Although a deal was later done on discontinuing use of those weapons, conventional weapons continued to be used with devastating consequences for the Syrian civilian population. In February 2014, UN-led peace talks collapsed. The UN adopted a series of resolutions calling upon the parties to the conflict to allow access for humanitarian agencies to civilians without success. And by mid-August 2014, we saw the entry onto the scene of Daesh, or the Islamic State, which by late 2014 was controlling main Syrian oil and gas fields in strategic locations. In August 2014, the UN Secretary-General stated that the conflict continues to be characterized by horrendous violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses with total disregard for humanity. By the end of 2014, the UN Security Council had noted that an estimated 190,000 people had died in the conflict thus far, including 10,000 children. The UN Human Rights Council convened an independent international commission of inquiry on Syria, which has produced several reports over recent years. In August 2014, its report documented, and I quote, immeasurable suffering amongst the Syrian population, noting that government and pro-government forces, as well in increasing in terms, the Islamic State also were engaged in committing murder, torture, rape, forced disappearance, recruiting children for hostilities, targeting civilians, massacres and hostage-taking, noting that these together amounted to gross human rights violations, war crimes, crimes against humanity and violations of international humanitarian law. At the same time, displacement continued to mount, in many cases jump, into the neighbouring countries. In March 2012, a year after the conflict began, some 40,000 people were estimated to have fled to neighbouring countries, notably Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey. By November of that same year, some 7 months later, 400,000 refugees were in the neighbouring countries. By March 2013, that had risen to 1 million, and by March 2014, 1 year thereafter, 2.5 million refugees were recorded in the neighbouring countries, as well as 6.5 million internally displaced. Today, as of May 2015, the total is estimated at close to 3.9 million refugees in the neighbouring countries. This is broken down into 1.7 million hosted by Turkey and registered by the government there, Lebanon with some 1.2 million refugees, Jordan with 628,000, Iraq with close to 250,000, Egypt hosting 133,000, and several North African countries together with 24,000 refugees. Of this refugee population, approximately half in the region are below 18. Thousands of those children lack access to schooling. Some 75% of registered refugees live outside camps, some in host families, but many others on the rental market where prices have risen to very difficult levels for many. 38% are in substandard accommodation. Half of the refugees borrow money to survive, and many are destitute. In Lebanon, it's noted that some half of the refugee population is living below the poverty line on less than $4 per day. So what is the international community doing to seek to address this? Well, a number of UN agencies and other humanitarian organisations have put together several successive plans calling for donor support to allow them to address these needs. The most recent being the Regional Resilience and Refugee and Resilience Plan, the so-called 3RP, that was released in December 2014. That plan calls for some US $5.5 billion to support a projected 4.3 million refugees by the end of this year, seeking to bring together humanitarian support and development assistance to assist also some 1.7 million host community members in countries in the region around Syria. That appeal was funded at 19% as of the middle of May, meaning that some 80% of the needs projected so far remain to be addressed. The European Union has made a significant contribution to the humanitarian aid effort, with some 3.1 billion euros contributed thus far by the EU and its 28 member states together. This has included emergency aid as well as development assistance and early recovery support, providing for food assistance, safe water supplies, emergency medical assistance, shelter, and cash for subsistence. So the EU has been quite generous in financial terms to Syrian refugees. But has this commitment been matched by its action to provide protection directly to refugees at its doorstep and in its territory? Before examining the EU's response to asylum seekers, I'd like to recall the UNHCR's most recent analysis of the legal position of Syrians under international refugee law. UNHCR has issued a series of protection consideration documents, including the most recently of October 2014, which document the international protection needs of Syrians in light of international refugee law criteria and standards from UNHCR's point of view. And UNHCR has concluded that the vast majority of refugees from Syria do satisfy the criteria of Article 1A of the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. In other words, they satisfy the definition of a refugee that binds some 167 countries and is included in the international law of many of those. It finds that most of those people do need refugee protection because they have a well-founded fear of persecution that is directly linked to one of the 1951 Convention grounds. This link to the Convention may lie in either direct or indirect, as well as a real or perceived association with a party to the conflict, in addition to other characteristics of the person in question relating to their race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group, or political opinion. UNHCR maintains that there should be no requirement of having been individually targeted in the sense of being singled out for persecution on the part of refugees. This means that in UNHCR's views, Syrians may be at risk due to their imputed political opinion. They may be considered to have aligned themselves with one or other party to the conflict simply because they were residing in a neighbourhood or a village that was held by one of those parties at a particular time, or because they railed actively to resist an occupying force. If they belong to a religious or ethnic minority, they may also have a particular political view attributed to them, which may provide the pretext for persecution on the part of one of those parties involved in the conflict. UNHCR also considers, in the increasingly exceptional cases where the 1951 Convention criteria are not met, that states must give consideration to applying broader refugee criteria. This means the criteria that are enshrined in other regional refugee instruments beyond the Refugee Convention, and in the EU context, for example, subsidiary protection, which is available for people who are at risk of torture, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, or an individual threat in situations of indiscriminate violence. It also means that they should be considered in HCR's view, if not found to be refugees, for national forms of protection. UNHCR acknowledges that exclusion criteria may apply. This means that some Syrians seeking refuge may be found to fall within the criteria of Article 1F of the 1951 Convention because they are guilty of committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, or acts contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. This could arise based on unlawful attacks on civilians, based on murder, torture, or other serious rights violations they may have committed, participation in activities leading to forced displacement, or rape and other forms of sexual or gender-based violence. However, HCR has cautioned that exclusion clauses must be applied with great care, and that individual responsibility must be found on the part of the person concerned before they can be excluded from refugee protection. I'd like to move now to the third part of my presentation relating to the EU responses to Syrians seeking protection thus far. The total number of asylum seekers in the EU, plus Norway, Liechtenstein, Sweden and Monaco, to end of May 2015 is approximately 210,000. Many of those who have applied are refugees surplus, meaning that they may have left Syria before or for reasons unrelated to the conflict, but they have become unable to return because of the risk of persecution that would face them. Some 60% of those who have applied for protection in the EU have done so in Sweden and Germany. There is also another group of 5 states who accommodate approximately a quarter, being the Netherlands, Austria, Bulgaria, Denmark and Hungary. And the result is that some 23 European countries host the remaining 20% of the Syrian refugee caseload. Clearly a highly uneven distribution of the challenges and demands that are generated by the Syrian refugee population. A leading member of the European Parliament in December 2012 has characterised the European Union's response so far as somehow contradictory, noting that a very small percentage of Syrian refugees are in EU Europe, primarily in two northern countries. She has noted that the EU is, and I quote, asking Syria's neighbours to open their borders, but we are refraining from doing the same. It's noteworthy to see that at this stage, most countries in the EU are generally granting high protection rates to Syrians. Some 91% today receive protection in EU member states where they apply. But this has not always been the case. And up until late 2014, we were seeing recognition rates varying between 0 to 99%. We still see extremely different approaches taken by member states to the criteria for protection. Some member states giving overwhelmingly refugee protection in line with UNHCR's recommendations, but a number of others who are giving subsidiary protection in most cases with lesser rights associated with that status. Others are giving national forms of status, which with yet lower levels of entitlements as well. There's also been a number of problematic practices documented over the years. Backlogs allowed to develop, despite the fact that these claims by and large should be granted speedily. Lack of contingency planning to enable swift access to reception conditions and to entitlements. A particularly intense focus on security concerns and risks of extremism as they are perceived on the part of Syrian refugees in some cases. We've also seen problematic reports of denials of access for Syrians to borders, and in some cases, failure to observe basic standards for treatment of asylum seekers, which means that Syrians in many cases have chosen to move on, either feeling unable to pursue their refugee claim in some of the first countries in which they've arrived, or driven by the desire to reunite with family, consistent with their European and international human rights. Apart from its varied response to Syrians within its territory, the EU has also sought to take a number of steps, albeit limited so far, for refugees beyond its territory who are in need of protection. As a gesture of solidarity and burden sharing with some of those countries that are hosting the largest numbers, the EU has committed itself to undertake resettlement and humanitarian admission for some of the Syrians in particularly Lebanon, Turkey, and Jordan. Resettlement involves the selection and transfer of refugees from a third state to another, which agrees to admit them as refugees and to give them long-term protection rights. Humanitarian admission is a similar process that a number of EU member states are practicing, which involves, in principle, a temporary right to stay. It's noteworthy, however, that the states that have practiced humanitarian admission so far in the EU have very positively committed to refrain from returning people until such time as return to Syria in safety and dignity as possible. Resettlement enables countries offering protection to prioritise vulnerable people in particular, women and girls at risk, survivors of torture and violence, those with specific medical needs that can't be met in their first country of asylum, as well as older, vulnerable adults and separated family members. This also includes refugees facing serious threats to their physical security where they are. The EU until now has pledged close to 40,000 places altogether. And this is the commitment made by 15 EU member states, as well as 3 non-EU member states, notably Liechtenstein, Norway and Switzerland. This number is a significant increase on the amount of resettlement the EU has been prepared to do in the past, but it remains small compared to the numbers of refugees in need of protection in the region, and also falls far short of UNHCR's call for 100,000 resettlement places by the end of 2016. What's been noteworthy also around the EU's response is its unwillingness thus far to use a legal instrument that arguably was adopted specifically for the purpose of dealing with an emergency of this kind. The EU's Temporary Protection Directive, adopted in 2001, provides a framework for the EU to admit swiftly and provide protection to refugees who might arrive in a so-called mass influx. This instrument, designed to deal with a situation like that seen during the wars of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, has never been used until now. And although it would enable the EU to respond very swiftly to those arriving at its borders, it's not been used to date, largely because of the perception that this would lead to a so-called pull factor, attracting many more refugees from the region to the EU. I'd like to highlight two cases in point which demonstrate the problematic shortfalls in the EU's response until now. Firstly, that of Bulgaria, a country which received less than 1,000 asylum claims per year until 2013, when a sudden increase came in the form of some 7,000 Syrians seeking protection in its territory. Bulgaria's reception capacity was swiftly overwhelmed. It was unable to accommodate, register, or process the asylum claims of those people seeking its protection. UNHCR, the European Commission, and the European Asylum Support Office mobilised a number of programs and assistance measures to help it to respond. But Bulgaria remains unable to provide standard protection and entitlements of an adequate standard to meet EU norms for many of those arriving. Another clear case of challenges the EU has not been able to address adequately is that of sea arrivals. Some 219,000 people arrived in the EU by sea in 2014. Over half came from Syria and Eritrea. It's clear that the reception capacity in countries where they have arrived in the largest number has swiftly been overwhelmed, and yet the EU has been unable until now to put in place capacity to ensure that people can be rescued where they get into distress situations at sea, and swiftly receive protection in cases where this is merited. Against this background, I'd like to pose three questions about the EU's response so far. First of all, could we really say that states' responses to Syrian displacement in the EU so far have managed to effectively reconcile refugee protection obligations on the one hand with concerns about security, national politics, and the desire to keep refugee numbers to manageable levels on the other? Secondly, can we say that the principle of solidarity, both within and beyond the EU, that the European Union member states have continuously expressed, has been put into practice in the Syria response? And thirdly, whether or not there's been sufficient long-term thinking about how to give the EU the flexibility it needs to deal with sudden crisis on the scale we have seen. I think it's clear that these all need further consideration and work before the EU can be said satisfactorily to have met these challenges. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best with your work.